There's a drop of water on the wall, and the drop's about to fall, and it falls into a trickle, and the trickle's flowing down, down, down to the ground, and the moss begins to grow. Watch, 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 watch the water flow, and watch the current become a stream, busting through the seams, cracking through the concrete, bending down the steel, in a raging that is real, a tearing torrent you can feel the thunder growing, thunder underground, and in my heart the chains falling apart, the wildness in my soul, and for once in life, I know I'm not alone. For the mountains make our bones, with the oceans in our blood, our feet planted firmly in the mud. We are alive, the burning embers in our eyes, the tingling touch upon our skin. And in the heat of passion we begin to understand that we are of this land, that we are part of Earth, and when it's threatened, we will fight for all we're worth. We watch the dam come crashing down, water rushing to the sea, and now the river, now the river, now the river, now is free.
This is more than just a creek.
The name San Francisquito begins here at the base of Searsville Dam on Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. But since fish can't read maps, names of waterways are often artificial. You see, spawning fish can no longer make it up into Corte Madera Creek in Portola Valley, but they can continue up Bear Creek into the headwaters of Woodside. Down below Highway 280, Los Trancos Creek joins San Francisquito, so fish have yet another option. That's why it's important to look at the entire watershed, which also drains parts of Palo Alto, Stanford, Menlo Park, and East Palo Alto. It's all of ours to share and protect.
In spite of how much time I'd spent in creeks and things, for some reason, I never related those creeks to providing water that we would be using and drinking. And one of the reasons why was they didn't. The water that we were drinking was coming from 200 miles away, or from, you know, other places, Hetch Hetchy, Shasta Dam. And our creeks were not looked upon as a water source. They were looked upon as something that was problematic, something that got in the way of development and needed to be controlled and taken care of. And basically the water needed to be gotten rid of just as immediately as possible.
Although San Francisquito Creek has been largely neglected for the past century, in recent years a growing number of local residents have taken interest in the waterway. In 1993, Community Creek Watch conducted a biological inventory to record the plants and animals that depend on this riparian ecosystem.
As you know, the biological inventory was set up by the Environmental Protection Agency to find data or collect data in the creeks by the citizens that live near the creeks. The reason for that is because, number one, the EPA doesn't have the money to do a comprehensive biological inventory of the creek, and also because we're concerned that the citizens living near the creek often don't have very much information about what's happening in the creek and how their behavior affects the creek. When they drain their swimming pools into their storm drains, it goes right into the creek frequently, and they don't realize that. We've been seeing a lot of fish, more than even our fisheries biologists would have expected us to. We've been seeing roach and hitch, which are two minnow species. We've seen trout and even some baby steelhead called par, excuse me. And in addition to that, we've found frogs and lizards and just innumerable birds.
We were down here at this point doing a class one time, and a jaybird came screaming up the creek past us, and about 10 feet behind it was a red-shouldered hawk, and chased him out of the creek completely, and then took his position up on the tree above us where he has a nest.
Perhaps the most famous resident of San Francisquito Creek is the steelhead trout.
In March of 1988, when we had finished the cleanup, I found 2 dead steelhead, both of them about 30 inches long, below a little dam at the foot of El Palo Alto. It's a stream stabilization dam that keeps the wall from being undermined. A steelhead is basically a rainbow trout that has gone to sea. They undergo physiological change that allows them to exist in salt water, and almost any rainbow can do that. And they'll live in the sea for 1, 2, 3 years, and then they'll come back to spawn in their home waters. They key to the scent of the waters in which they were spawned and try to return to it. But sometimes they can't return because barriers have been erected, or diversions have been made so there's not enough water in the creek, or it becomes too polluted, or the cover is cut down and it's too warm. Many different reasons why the fish aren't able to return. San Francisquito Creek is a refugia stream. It's the last steelhead stream in the South Bay. It's one of the few that doesn't have large dams or impediments near its mouth.
A couple of years ago, with some pretty aggressive education from both Cal Trout and the Friends of San Francisquito Creek, Stanford and the Water Department, which is what I'm a part of, came to a conclusion that we needed to do something about the habitat of San Francisquito and Los Trancos Creek. This is a site where we take water from Los Trancos Creek and divert it along a canal into a felt lake. 2 or 3% of the fish that come upstream that can pass through the structure, and that might even be high. About a month ago, it became apparent to us that the fish ladder system for this particular site was going to be a very expensive piece of construction work, and then extremely difficult to maintain. So we started to explore a different concept, and that was to breach this entire structure, tear it down, and restore the stream bed to its natural flow, which obviously would be the most beneficial to the fish. It's going to cost Stanford some more money on an annual operating basis to pump the water out of the creek into the diversion. But when we get this structure, either a fish ladder built and or the structure demolished, we will expect about 95% of the fish that approach this location will continue upstream to do their thing.
It's amazing how few people know that it's a steelhead stream, and perhaps that's a well-kept secret, you know. We don't want poaching to go on in this stream. There is no fishing allowed here. In fact, the land we're sitting on right now is a state fish and game refuge.
Once was a time, water was sacred. Once was a time, water was pure. Once was a time, water was sacred. Once was a time, water was pure. Water was blessed and handled with care. Water to heal and water to share. Once there was a time, water was sacred. Once there was a time, water was pure. Once there was a time, water was sacred. Once there was a time, water was pure.
We're concerned primarily what comes out the outfalls into the creek. This comes from a storm drain up on the street, and a lot of times people will use it as a dumping place. They'll put their used motor oil or their used antifreeze down the storm drains, and it gets into the creek, and both those chemicals are toxic to the fish and invertebrates that live in San Francisquito Creek.
In practical terms, what's really happened, there's been an awful lot of public education just to help people understand that stormwater just flows right through that gutter in the street, through a pipe into a creek. There's no treatment, and a lot of people don't even begin to have that appreciation. In addition to metals, you've got organic pollutants and fertilizers and pesticides that are also of concern. South Bay has been South Bay, south of the Dumbarton Bridge, has been designated by the state and federal agencies as being a toxic hotspot with these heavy metals. So you've got copper from brake pads, you've got high potential loading sources of silver and mercury from diesel exhaust, cadmium and zinc from tire wear, all of which say anything we can do to help make alternative transit and bicycles and walking more convenient for people and get them out of cars is something we all should be working on.
Right where we're sitting right now, during the summer, we saw some oil coming out and hydrocarbons, and they saw that it went down into the creek and was forming a layer, an iridescent layer. So they knew that that was dangerous to the invertebrates that lived in that pond. So what we did was we went out to figure out where it was coming from, and we found a restaurant that had a grease trap or a grease holding very close to their storm drain. So we went and we talked to the manager and we explained to him where it went and the harm that it did. And so he was very good about changing the problem. And in the next couple of weeks, we noticed that there was no more oil or grease coming out of this outfall.
I do a lot of cleanup down there with groups of people and by myself, and you really find absolutely everything discarded into the creek. It's really kind of like the alternate municipal dump, unfortunately, for a lot of people. So, you know, I've found everything. I could make you a shopping list of interesting items that would last all day. You know, we just saw a tennis racket. Recently I found a wetsuit and a wig and a refrigerator, car batteries, bleach bottles, you know, there are syringes, there's just all kinds of stuff that shouldn't be in there.
When I began to be concerned about El Palo Alto, I also became concerned about the trash in the creek. Frankly, the area around El Palo Alto and its creek was becoming just a junk pile. And so I started by buying a rope and pulling out 6 fat shopping carts, seven it was. And one of them was a Safeway cart that said, once is all it takes. And as soon as I pulled that one out, I realized that's true. You know, I've begun, I'm committed, and it went on from there.
A lot of times people will put their yard clippings into the creek, and they think this is sort of natural and organic way to get rid of it, but there's several problems when you put your yard waste. The first thing is that a lot of times exotic species will get introduced into the creek. So you'll see things like rose bushes growing in odd places or palm trees growing in odd places. And this doesn't provide food for the natural wildlife, so that's a problem. Plus, as it slides down the hillside, it'll cause erosion of the stream bank. Then, as it decomposes, it adds excess nutrients into the creek and will also use up the oxygen that is needed by the fish and the invertebrates in the water. So it's best to keep your yard clippings in your own backyard and mulch them there, or have the garbage people take it away.
Manure can be a problem because it's the small particles of the horse manure get into the gravel where the steelheads spawn, where their eggs are hatched. They spawn in at the base of pools where the water is just breaking into the riffles, and at that position they've got a lot of water that's flowing past the eggs, which are laid inside the gravel, between the particles of gravel, in nests that they build by or that they dig by flopping their bodies up and down sideways like that, so they hollow out a space. The female lays her eggs and the male covers them with milk simultaneously. And then they both go upstream a little bit and they do that flopping again on their sides, and the gravel washes into the red. So a little nest is formed there. And then the water passing through it keeps them well oxygenated while they're developing. And it takes about a month and a half before they develop. But if there's manure being put into the water, a lot of times the fine particles or silt from upstream from logging operations, which washes down, fills that gravel, and they're no longer able to get the oxygen that they need to develop, and it kills them rather rapidly.
The biggest threat to San Francisquito Creek is development too close to its banks. Not only is valuable riparian habitat lost, but property owners are constantly fighting to keep their land from eroding into the creek. Measures to protect local residents from flooding could potentially have devastating impacts on the wildlife of San Francisquito.
I got involved with it in the early 60s. I used to live in the Willows area for many years. And the 55 floods probably was the first involvement. No, I was really involved with it prior to that because I was involved when they rebuilt the Pope Street Bridge. We had a little narrow concrete bridge that went into Palo Alto, and there was always lots of complaints about that bridge. And finally our group, I think, was one of the people that was involved with the county engineer in getting a new bridge built, one with a big tube in it. By the time that bridge was built, that big tube was big enough, but now it's silted in, so it doesn't take as much water as it did at one time. Well, that was, I don't remember the exact year, but then we come along the 1955 flood. The heavy rains in 1955 where it went over the bank into Palo Alto. The Palo Alto side, of course, was a little lower, and it did do a great deal of damage in Palo Alto, there's no question about it. So I became active in it at that period of time, and our county formed what they called the San Francisquito Flood Control District for maintenance purposes only and construction. So after that period of time, our county and Santa Clara County Water District was called in, jointly formed an organization that improved the creek banks from roughly Pope Street down to the Bayshore Highway. What you see there today was done under that construction, during that construction period. All those sandbags and all that stuff, that wall that's in East Palo Alto was all built at that time. And of course that was done principally to keep the water within the creek.
San Francisquito has a steep upper watershed, so although it's a pretty arid climate here, not a lot of rainfall, our rainfall comes concentrated in a very short period of time. When we have, and it doesn't have to be as big of a storm as a 1%, but when we have a bigger storm event, all that water comes rushing off the hills very quickly, and it's more water than the creeks have the capacity to carry away to the bay. And so that water then comes up out of the creeks and floods homes and businesses and streets, and that's where the flood damages are created.
The flood control treats the creeks as storm drains. They're just concrete sluiceways, cold, barren, ugly.
We find ourselves with communities that exist in those floodplains, with homes and businesses and streets that are critical to the economy of the Santa Clara Valley, and so we have to find physical things to do then to go back and fix that problem that we ourselves created by building in an area where it was natural to flood.
The threat will be that if there's not sufficient room to do bypass channels or some other form of flood control to hold back the flow of water, the flood control district won't have any choice but to build concrete channels. They need room to be able to either hold back some of the water in the upper reaches, or they need opportunities to have a channel that's buried somewhere else to take off extra flow, or they need room for a system called setback levees where you can maintain the integrity of the creek corridor but have levees on the outside to protect the residences or the development from the effects of the flooding.
My fear for San Francisquito is that we have done an enormous amount of work in many parts of the county, and when I look at the data about the damages that remain, it worries me that we have not found solution, a recommended alternative that would be acceptable that we could move forward with. And my personal fear is that if we don't make some progress, if I don't push or try to facilitate or grease some skids somewhere, that people will say that I didn't do what I was responsible to do as flood control manager, and that is to try to eliminate as many of the high priority flooding problems as I can. So that's why I'm excited for an opportunity to have some dialogue about this problem, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my fear.
Putting our heads together and thinking in a constructive manner, we could probably create viable floodplains that would take care of a lot of the flooding problem downstream. And some of the trade-offs, it's almost a debt for nature type of swap, you know. Some of the trade-offs we could come up with for people who live downstream who are suffering from flooding problems to perhaps put some money into a soil bank type of thing for buying property that could be used as a floodplain. I know after the disasters this year along the Mississippi, there's a lot of government agencies that are looking at doing that, of not restoring the property but buying them up and leaving them as floodplain.
The erosion is forever changing because of conditions. That creek finds its own course, just like the Mississippi wants to find its own course. But the big problem is that the soil on the top, a lot of it is soft and loose, and in heavy rains it falls in. And then Stanford will come along, not anymore, they've stopped doing it, but a few years back, they've come along and dumped a great deal of debris into the creek, and that of course changes the creek channel. Well, Menlo Park was no angel either. Menlo Park in a period in the 50s, I guess, or 60s, they used to let the cement trucks down here dump their spillage at the end of the day into the creek to try to protect the bank.
We're responsible to maintain stream channels where we own right-of-way. We in many areas in the county, we're doing that. In San Francisquito, we have a lot of right-of-way. What we do relative to maintenance in San Francisquito Creek, we have because the creek is the boundary between two counties, it just gives us one more layer of complication. We meet with San Mateo County and look at stream problems, erosion problems along the entire length of the stream there to see where the problems are, what's causing it, and who ought to fix what this year. And so we do some stream bank maintenance. It can entail gabion sections, which are wire boxes filled with rocks. Sometimes it's just a matter of stabilizing a slope at a natural slope that it will hold for the kind of soil that it is. Sometimes we have to build something that we call a harder kind of a wall. Sometimes we have to stabilize it so that it won't continue to erode with concrete or saccrete.
And when you line it, you get a smooth surface, and the water goes a lot faster, and it creates problems someplace else. All this has to be worked out together and integrated. We all have to work as a team. Somebody can't just build into the creek because it's their property and forget the next guy down the stream.
There's a long tradition among democracies that there's a place in which the government steps in when it feels that the greater need of the public is, the public need is greater than that of the individual property owner, and makes a determination about what happens with that piece of property. And I think that in America, our misuse of our natural resources in many cases has reached a point where I think that step is going to have to be taken, and that there are going to be some very strong recommendations for landowners to keep a setback of perhaps 50 to 100 feet from the creek as part of the restrictions on being able to develop it.
Well, I think the public officials could organize a committee with some teeth in it, a group from public officials of Palo Alto and Menlo Park and Stanford, basically, and East Palo Alto and Portola and Woodside. We're all involved in this, and San Mateo County and Santa Clara. They have to be a coordinating group of people that will devote their energies to preserving this creek.
After decades of working to protect San Francisquito Creek, Ira Bundy passed away on September 26, 1993. 2 months later, Jim Johnson and other concerned parties introduced a coordinated resources management plan for the watershed. The CRIMP is a process for facilitating decision-making by stakeholders, elected officials, and agencies responsible for the creek. The group looks at everything from development along its banks to homeless people living within the creek.
Anytime you put together a program so that you can sit down and bring all the interested and concerned people to the table, it has to work out to be better than not talking about it.
For the first time since Europeans have really been in this area, we have the opportunity to look at the creek and its watershed as a unifying feature instead of a dividing line.
And of course, we're all looking at what Stanford may ultimately do with the development on Willow West and the Indian burial grounds, of how close that they will come to the creek. And we have grave concerns about the area of the creek between Ronald McDonald House and El Camino.
Willow West is now called Stanford West, although some locals refer to the open space as Ohlone Field, in honor of the Native Americans who inhabited the area for 5,000 years before the arrival of Europeans.
Archaeological sites, village sites, are always located on freshwater sources. So on the peninsula, they're located along creeks, which is why San Francisquito is so important. It's a major drainage on the peninsula. Stanford West is this vacant parcel along Sand Hill Road. And in 1982, after the first EIR, or the first draft of an EIR, the anthropology department, one archaeological site was recorded by a consultant. And the anthropology department here, Professor John Rick and the graduate student Barbara Bocek, asked the university for permission to survey the land and to make a recommendation about preserving the archaeological site, which the consultant had recommended that they build on top of. And they did a survey out here that indicated that there might be more than one archaeological deposit, and that the archaeological deposit in question, the main site here at the Stanford West parcel, was larger than was believed.
Although in recent years Stanford has taken measures to involve the community in its development plans, many local residents feel there is little they can do to have a real influence on the university.
Well, right behind me, across the street from my house, is an 8-foot outfall into the creek. It was built in 2 weeks. All of a sudden the trees were down and there was machinery there, and all the neighbors were calling Stanford. And Stanford said, "We have so many projects, we don't know what you're talking about." I said, "It's the big pipe." But we didn't get any answer to the thing until over a year later, when Stanford acknowledged that the big pipe was there. But they've never quite said what it's for. And my speculation is that it's to drain the right-of-way of the proposed extension of Sand Hill Road, so that the road can be built. And when the road can be built, then the housing can be built.
With no paved surfaces and no roofs, rain had a chance to percolate into the ground, become part of the groundwater table, and so every time you add what's called an impervious or hard surface, sidewalks and roofs and roads, you deny Mother Nature the opportunity to let rainfall soak in, and it has to run off someplace.
Stanford's development is massive along that corridor and ignored the problem of creek flooding cumulatively in the past. So I think that Stanford needs to acknowledge some responsibility for the amount of water that's going to flow into that creek as a result of their projects.
As we get deeper into the process of the crimp, we're going to begin to understand that we need to significantly change how we as a nation and as a people understand what's important to us, and that money and development and perhaps flood control and things aren't the most important things. That the resources around us that we have to live with are far more important, and the people that are involved in the creek are the important part of it.
The earth is our mother, we must take care of